Hello, Internet. Gino, that Pinguino Grieco, here again with another episode of Deep Listens. I am joined, as always, by Billy the Mead Master Rothert.
You know, I do enjoy a delicious honey wine from time to time, especially that when it's infused with delicious flavorings. One of my favorite meads has been a fig-infused mead. It was wonderful. But hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this podcast. My name is Billy Rothard, a.k.a. Rothgar. Excited to talk about a cool concept today.
Yes. And we are also joined, as always, by Pete Littlebox Busby.
You know, I'd say Billy talking about mead infusions makes me irrationally angry, but I think it's completely rational to think that that's a strange thing to refer to. That his favorite mead is fig-infused. But
Yeah.
Billy, that's why you had that perspective, and I appreciate it.
Yes.
Wait, that just made you're just tilted for the discussion of flavor-infused mead?
Like, it's the phrase I want to use. There's it's a thing. I'll come up with it. Circle back.
All right.
Yeah.
Is it hipster? Is the term you're looking for hipster?
I didn't want to use, it's not quite hipster, but it's close for like a fig-infused mead. Like needlessly esoteric, would that be?
Sure.
I mean, it's more like...
it's not it's not like it's kumquat infused. I feel like
there's
that
a
would
difference between like mead that is made with other fruits and like cotton candy infused vodka. Like that's obviously trash.
So,
but I see nothing wrong with like blackberry mead or like elderberry. Like
these both raise some questions to me. First question, before we get to our actual topic. Welcome to this video game podcast. First question is, when you infuse something, does that mean you soaked whatever the drink is in, like, with whatever you're infusing? Does that mean that a cotton candy infused vodka had to have cotton candy soaked in the vodka and then you strain out the cotton candy? Because I don't think that's possible. Yeah.
That's how most actual infused vodkas are made. Like, if you wanted to have at a nice bar or restaurant an infused vodka, you would, like, put them in large containers with other elements to have a flavor permeate the vodka.
Hang on a sec. I want to jump in here, though. As, you know, probably the least, let's say, least liquor-qualified person here, but vodka's flavorless.
Ideally.
Right. Once you start adding flavors, it's no longer a vodka. I think at that point, it technically becomes a gin.
I think it becomes a schnapps.
Schnapps? Okay.
I think that is what schnapps is.
I'm also not
sure.
knowledgeable enough, but
I
I have watched enough Bar Rescue to
Yes.
know that when he yells at people for not flavor infusing vodkas, that then they show them how easy it is to do to just
like
get
steaming.
basically you get like a punch dispenser and just put a bunch of vodka in it, but also fruit. And oh, look at that. You've got raspberry infused vodka.
Makes sense.
I think when they do this with the mead, they actually include this fruit as an additional sugar that the yeast consumes and turns into alcohol.
Okay, that's pretty good. My other question was going to be, when something is infused with an essence, is that any different than just infusing it with the regular shit?
Like when you infuse materia into a weapon and you get
right.
Let's put this
fire
in terms
too?
so our listeners will understand.
Yes.
That because they understand Final Fantasy by now. We know that for damn sure.
We do. The numbers show.
Science.
Yes. Yeah. So thank you, Billy, for bringing your mead discussion here.
Who called me the mead master?
I did. I didn't
First
think.
of all,
I wasn't thinking. I'm sorry.
I wouldn't call myself a mead master.
Are you?
I wonder if they have mead sommeliers.
I hope so. But they are very different from wine sommeliers, I'm sure. Very surly.
A lot of overlap there.
Weirdly enough, same equipment. They've got the little sippy cup that ooh, this mead's really good. It's a fine year. How would you know if mead's bad? These are not for now. Questions for another day.
I don't think mead can have a bad year because like it's honey.
I don't know. One day, if we have any listeners who are mead sommeliers, please write in. Please correct our mead facts. I'm sure we're wrong. Or if someone knows about infusing alcohol, that also, if you could explain that process to me, because right now it's voodoo as far as I'm concerned, and bullshit. Voodoo and bullshit. So,
very true.
today's episode is a special episode because we have not gotten far enough into Persona 5 to discuss it yet. And so I decided, hey, listeners, I'll put out a call, see if there's any topic that our listener base would like us to discuss. So this is a listener-suggested podcast today. If you want to get in touch with the show and submit podcast ideas for future times when we don't have an off-week podcast and need to come up with something hastily, go ahead. What?
This isn't a hasty decision. It's just more like a impromptu discovered gem.
It's community building.
Yes,
Yeah.
we're giving the people what they want.
Yeah,
Which is
apparently
themselves.
mead discussion.
Yes.
Yeah, me discussion and their own discussions.
You can hit us up at Deep Listens Pod on Twitter, or just hit me up personally at That Pinguino on Twitter. Most people seem to do that instead, which is totally fine. Deep Listens Podcast at gmail.com or deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got comment sections there. Join the discussion. Hashtag join the discussion. So, this was suggested by Jeff Rude at Electric Viking on Twitter. And he suggested, talk about where and how we buy games and what difference that makes. I'm going to extrapolate that. So how does where we buy games impact our enjoyment of them and our appreciation of said games?
Mm-hmm.
So first question for you guys, what would you say is the number one way you actually buy games when you buy them? GameStop, online?
Oh,
Amazon?
I mean, if we look at total, GameStop is probably still in the lead because it had such a hefty run in sort of my younger days. But God forbid I ever have to step into a GameStop again.
Yeah. Billy, how's about you?
Huh. I'd honestly say that since for so many of my youthful gaming years, my birthday and Christmas lined up in such a way that I could have a pretty solid collection of new games. I would get, 2 or 3 for Christmas and a couple for my birthday, and that would last me the year until the next round. That's actually how I got most of my games. I think that's an important part of the discussion is, did you actually seek out the game and get it yourself, or did you get it as a gift? That's going to affect some of my responses to this question. So when I was young, I got my games for Christmas or birthdays primarily. In my teen years, when I got my first car, I was mobile. I would then go to a place to buy my games. And now that I am an adult, air quotes, I now do something different.
Yeah, for me, I was definitely EB 90% of the time. The electronics boutique until it was then consumed by GameStop. And then
Back before when it was still fancy. It was a boutique.
Yeah, it was, what is this artisanal GBA cart? But then mostly nowadays I get things via download on Steam or PSN. I do sometimes meander into a GameStop now and then to see if there's a used game or an older game that would be harder for me to get a hold of, and maybe I don't want to wait the 2 days for Amazon to deliver it. And wow, those stores are weird now.
They're super strange. We can get on this topic more directly later, but I do want to rail against the rise of pre-ordering as a trend in purchasing games as well. What a scam that is.
Yes, we can totally rail against pre-ordering, though. I think some of the more esoteric games on my shelf are a result, or versions of games, I should say, that are on my shelf, are a direct result of pre-order pressure. So I have a weird place in my heart for pre-ordering, but we can discuss that more later. If you've been to a GameStop recently, they've consumed FYE and a used phone store, it seems like they've got weird geek culture shit, little posters and
the cutouts and stuff that FYE used to have.
Yeah, here's a statuette of Groot, and here's an entire shelf where we'll sell different trading cards, and then over here we've got some geek apparel, and then in this little corner, at least at my local GameStop, we'll have a used Kindle that you could buy, and all of these things are in the same space, and I feel like it's a sign that they're dying.
Or they're evolving.
Yes.
They're desperately trying to stay alive.
Yes. Because the used game market's going away.
So, go ahead,
part of the
Pete.
weakness, I want to say is, all right, so like PlayStation Network, whatever, what's the name of the Xbox equivalent? Is it just Marketplace still?
I believe so.
So the rise of PlayStation Network and Xbox Marketplace means you can just download games. And I think where games, like if you look at games versus Kindle, like I don't really feel like there's the same, oh, I need to have a physical copy here, where some people would just like a physical book or something like that. So if you don't have these geek culture ephemera, just download it.
I do have the geek culture ephemera. So
Nice.
I do need that a little bit, because I like to actually, I just recently got my hands on a copy of The Last Guardian, a game that I've been waiting over 10 years to play. And the first thing I did, I licked the case. It wasn't even my game.
You claimed it
It
as
was
your
someone
own?
else. It was someone else's, but I licked it.
I'm proud that you were able to admit that on microphone. We have that forever. We'll send that to your parole officer.
Yeah.
Is it sexual? Is it gustatory? Like what sort of licking?
I guess
was
it's
this?
only sexual if I got aroused, which I did. So I
Did the
guess
Did the game get aroused?
it jostled in its case, so there seemed to be some sort of physical response. Maybe
So-
that sort of uncomfortableness you get in your trousers when the tectonic plates start shifting, and maybe that's what the game was experiencing.
So what you're saying is the physical copy did something a little extra for you there. Wait, I
I'd
can't
say
get past
it
this.
did exactly a little extra.
Whose copy did you lick?
It was John's.
God. Friend of the podcast.
I don't have a PS4 yet,
Maybe no longer. But
so
Maybe not anymore. But you licked his... Did you ask him if it was okay first? Or did you just claim his...
that's not a question you ask. That's just something you do.
I just went in for it, man. I just went right in there.
Oh, God. Well, physical copies, I guess, still have their place. At least for me, trying to get this back off of this uncomfortable space we're in. I found that I still actually prefer going to a retail store, but it is a type of retail store that I prefer to go. There is a specific type of retail store that I prefer to go to. GameStop is no longer it. GameStop used to be my bread and butter, but now I largely go to kind of small independent game stores that will have a large retro game section. Now that could be at a PAX. You'll have multiple booths of retro game stores simultaneously selling. I've seeked out basically anytime I go to a new place, if I see a retro game store, I will go in for maybe an hour and just look at the shelves, look at all of the different old games they have, look at the new games they have. I am on the constant prowl for another copy of the game guide to Final Fantasy IX because my copy fell apart because I've thumbed through it too much. But the sorts of games that you find in those kind of small actual boutique stores, not like the electronics boutique, but the actual boutique stores, can really be very different. Stuff that you couldn't find sometimes when those games were new, you couldn't buy them in the US. And so being able to stumble across, an unopened copy of Super Mario RPG or something like that, or I have a copy of Rockman now, otherwise known as Mega Man, but it's the Japanese copy. Like, being able to find those games aren't that weird, but seeing stuff like Hello Kitty Puzzle Cube Battle, whatever the heck we played for the Community Endurance Run, I forget what that game was called, but stumbling across these weird one-off games is kind of my number one favorite thing in retail right now, is just kind of going into a place like that, talking to the owners, talking to the people back there, asking if they know of, actually have experienced any of these games, and have anything to suggest, because they might actually have played something that I've never heard of before. And unfortunately, stuff like Steam, it's just such a crapshoot to find a game that's good if it isn't highly advertised and you don't know it, and you haven't already read about it going into, the online storefront. Finding a new, interesting game is really difficult. So I just really enjoy going to spots like that, and almost all of the new games that or quote unquote new, the games that I've recently acquired physical copies of are almost solely through independent game stores.
Yeah, Steam there's sort of an interesting paradox in Steam where, like, obviously the selection's larger than the sort of, cool boutique stores you described, but it creates a sort of, paralysis by overchoice. But like the fact that you're limited lets you browse for some of these more esoteric games, whereas Steam's library is so huge and the possibility of navigating it is impossible, really, that you have to rely on the sort of, all right, what's featured? What are people reviewing the most heavily? And it necessarily, foregrounds a smaller selection of games.
Now, I want to push back a little bit because I think one of the things that I use the most about Steam is the I think it's called the queue. Is that I'm calling that the right feature? It's like the queue that like it selects a bunch of things that it wants you to look at.
Yeah,
I think it's called the queue.
I think it's like favorites or thing. It's
something
suggestions
like
for you.
It's basically suggestions tailor-made to you. And I found a couple of games on there that I wouldn't have been able to find. I should say. So I agree that Steam has a paralyzing selection, and just browsing for a game is impossibly difficult. But one thing that Steam does to mitigate that says you have these games and you like them. Here are some games that other people have bought and liked, kind of like you do on like an Amazon or eBay, where it says users who bought this also bought that. And they do it in music websites too, like Pandora or Spotify or whatever you might use.
Yeah. Go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, sure. If I could shout out a slightly more well-known podcast at the moment.
What?
You got? I know. I'm sorry, but it bears reference here. You guys know NPR's Invisibilia?
No, that is not one of the NPR podcasts I listen to. But.
Well, they did one recently on sort of how we create these boxes for ourselves through preferences. And Steam does widen it out in that way, but it's still based on your preferences, right? So they did a whole thing about how this guy created an app basically that would randomize everything, right? Just to expand his preference circle. So I don't know, if Steam created some sort of randomization, you'd have that sort of time sink problem where you waste a bunch of time on a crummy game, but you would escape the sort of tyranny of preference that those sort of recommendation lists create.
Yes, and that's something that jumps out to me, having experienced both the boutique store, the GameStop, and then the Steam online storefront and, PSN storefront. Those online storefronts, where they suffer is that, like you said, there's this tyranny of preference. Once you have shown interest in one genre of game, Steam will basically recommend you that style of game and then point curators. There's a Steam curator system that they have where it'll kind of suggest, hey, these people seem to like games you like, and here are lists of games they recommend. Maybe you should check those out. So it just keeps focusing you in and in and in on games that you've already played and uses those as keys to get into other things. Whereas at a place like some of the smaller boutique stores that I go to, there is an actual curation because there is storefront and store space and display space. And so there is a conscious choice by the store's proprietors to kind of show off the things that they think are cool and display them in a way that makes it attract the eye, even if the game itself might not necessarily appeal to me otherwise. So I can just think of, like, I remember seeing in a display case, they had a display that was a bunch of, like, Final Fantasy Tactics stuff, but it wasn't like the Final Fantasy Tactics game. It was like this Japanese original soundtrack next to a guidebook in English, next to, like, a small art book. And these were all things that I may not have wanted, but when you put them all in one place and set them up nicely and did a good job of curating, I wouldn't have even glanced at them if they were just in a rack, right? If it was just one disc in a pile of discs, I would not have looked at it for a second. But because it was nicely displayed and nicely showcased, I gave it a second look. Like, there were some other games that were like weird robot fighting games that I would never have even thought about. But because the owner of this store thought it was cool enough to showcase, all of a sudden I was like, maybe I should get this Robot Tyson game or whatever it is. Sure. But on Steam, it seems like a lot of the time, the display is basically what is the most recent thing that's come out that's big. And then here are things you've bought before. Based on those, here's some recommendations for you. And it makes it harder to get into new genres out of nothing.
No.
Versus just there's also the GameStop experience, the kind of big box store experience. And that is basically whatever is the newest hotness, we are going to try to sell it to you regardless of what you care about. And that is a completely different model than the other two. But I feel like that at least will force you to try a couple of different things, but it is so hit-driven and big budget-driven that it'll really skew your perspective on what games are and what they can be.
So I think that our generation, specifically the people that are our age, between 20 and 30, have a really like unique and narrow window of experience, because we are young enough to still we are young enough to still be looking for new games, looking for new experiences. And not to say that older generations can't, but they had a lot more of their gaming life tied to consoles and tied to game stores. Kids that are born 2000 and beyond, like kids that are 10, 12, 15 right now, never knew a world without the internet. So we might be in this weird middle ground where we had to grow up in game stores and game consoles, and by doing that, we had to learn how to browse for what we actually liked and measure up games based on how fun we think they would be to us. And yeah, sometimes you guys joke that I play games that are really like the same and they have a lot of the same style, but my actual video game collection's pretty diverse. I think the only thing that I don't have a lot of is sports games or shooter games.
That much is clear from when I dunked all over you in
yeah.
NBA ballers.
Yeah,
one-on-one.
Absolutely. But I think that we have a unique ability to shop for games that we think would be fun. So we built that skill, but now I actually use that in Steam and browse totally random titles because I use the Steam's tag system as well as one of the major things of like one of the major parts of browsing. So I might look at a game that I like and it says, oh, it has this particular like user described tag. I'll click on it and see what other games have that tag. And yeah, it still is sort of a preference engine, but it's other games that were described as action. But that might take me to a like platformer game, and it might take me to a fighting game, and it might take me to an adventure game. So that's I think a little bit different than just like a chugging out preference engine. Steam does have that. I'm not going to say Steam doesn't have that, but I think a gamer, a consumer that has had to look among genres of games and say, what might be fun on this shelf? Because we had to do that when we were kids. I think the three of us are of the age group that have a unique talent to use things like Steam or the PS Network or the Marketplace or whatever, and use them differently than a kid right now who's 10, 11, 12, who relies more on the suggestion engine because that's all they really knew. And going to a store was not as critical for their gaming experience as it was for us when we were their age.
Certainly. And I think that that's an interesting way to think about it. When you're using the tag system, it's almost like you're going to a library and or a bookstore, and there are a bunch of sections, fantasy, sci-fi, history, biographies, and you've got all of these discrete sections. And once you head to that section, you're going to get a whole wide range of things that are generally in that genre. But after you get to that section, you're basically thumbing through one at a time, reading the backs of books, trying to figure out what you want. it's kind of like a bookstore if there were no display cases and it was all shelves. And so it's kind of it puts a lot of the onus onto the user, onto the shopper, to kind of find something that they want and figure out among all of these things, what should I care about? And I think that's pretty different than the in-store experience at a boutique store. Now, at a GameStop or something like that, it is all 100% what is the latest, hottest thing, and that's going to dominate almost all the space in terms of advertisement and what's being put out in front of you. But I think that the aspect of curation, honest, like, I'm a retail person, I'm going to curate this space, and I'm going to make sure that my customers know what I think because I have expertise, is something that's really missing from Steam outside of the suggested play section. Otherwise, you're just kind of you're lost. You're in the history section and you're looking for one book, and it's, you might read 7 books that are on ancient Japanese history, and you're looking for a book on the American Revolution, and you just got to keep thumbing through by titles.
If Steam wanted to, how could they fix that?
I think that one of the problems, or I guess one of the design decisions that Steam made with its curator system, is that you basically have to follow a curator. They democratized the tools for curation to where any schmo can make a curation page, and if someone follows them, you can kind of make suggestions based on that. However, Steam, like Valve as a company, has not said, these are the games that we think are worth playing. These are the games that we get behind, or we have an in-house expert who this is their job, is to put the good stuff up there and make sure that these are the games that people should see and make recommendations. And I think that one way they could fix it is Valve recommends, or a tab, a sub-store that is like, hey, this is, Rita Video Games storefront. Rita Video Games is here, and she's going to sell you a bunch of games, and here's the ones you should really check out, with maybe a couple of lines of editorial on each game explaining why you should check this game out, what's cool about it.
So a top-tier system of curators, like maybe a person is so good at being a curator that they get upgraded to a storefront person.
Yeah. Or maybe Valve as a company just says, it is in our best interest to have someone who is actually a retail expert, someone who is going to be our retail representative on our digital storefront, and will be managing this section to serve our audience.
Right. I mean, I think that could be implemented, but
it would be different.
It would definitely be different. I think those double looks that you gave to that well placed presentation wouldn't really happen the same way, because you have to sort of click into the storefront unless they made it Steam's default page.
I think Steam's just necessarily going to want to crowdsource this thing too, in the way you're sort of describing they already do. Like when you have that sort of storefront, it's sort of paradoxical that you'd think, all right, it's a single person, so they'd necessarily have less knowledge than this sort of crowdsourced front. But weirdly enough, I would trust them more.
Because it's a human.
Yeah, they have more personal investment, like this is their shop, than this sort of crowdsourced monolith that you're sort of referring to. And you see GameStop trying this a little bit. I don't know how many times I've heard this ad where GameStop's like, listen, we get 500 games or something. We play every single one of them. Let us recommend them to you. I'm just like, GameStop, I don't trust you. I don't care what you have to say.
Yeah, you've burned me too many times, GameStop.
So let's try to discuss Steam as the platform of this part of the conversation. How does Steam affect how we interact with the game?
So for me, Steam is, it's just quick and dirty. I generally just go to Steam because I already know that the game is a game I want to play. Whatever game it is, maybe I heard about it on a site, or maybe I got it through a Humble Bundle or something, and Steam is just the vehicle through which I'm able to buy it. I almost never interact with the curator system. I almost never interact with the recommendations. I generally go in knowing what I want. And so Steam, it's very good for if you know what you want, because the lookups are fast, the download speeds are fast, and cloud saves. Steam is one of the few. Steam is kind of revolutionary compared to the old boxed experience, where because you have purchased through Steam, you are guaranteed a certain number of services that come along with your purchase, like the ability to delete and re-download, the ability to cloud save, the ability to just like one link from your on-disc game, you can generally jump to like the store page with a bunch of reviews and guides and stuff. And so there's all this built-in functionality thanks to you purchasing through this digital storefront. And so that really impacts my ability to play it. Like most of the games I've played through Steam for the podcast, if I've ever gotten stuck, it is through Steam that I found a guide, which is cool.
I also can't remember the last time I impulse bought a game. Like if I'm buying a game at this point in my life, maybe for Steam, some of their cheaper ones I might, but for the most part, I've done my research. I've looked at reviews. I know what I want going in, like you said, Gino. I can't remember the last time I just picked, or I guess I don't pick anything up on Steam.
Wuppo?
Oh, shit, you're right about Wuppo. But even then, I looked through before I bought Wuppo, but I was enticed by just Wuppo being Wuppo.
Which is a great reason.
Now, I would say that my experience with Steam is, as a consumer now, I wait to not pay full price for a game because I know Steam's going to have a sale. Yep. That's one of the major things that Steam has impacted about my purchasing and playing a game, is I might really want that game, but I know, man, it's going to fucking go on sale the week after I buy it. So I'm just going to put it on my wish list, and I'm going to get an email when it goes on sale, and I'm going to wait until it goes on sale.
Yeah, Steam, because it is so convenient and the sales are so fast and frequent and the discounts so high, it has led to a backlog situation in almost every player I've ever talked to who uses Steam. They just have this gigantic backlog of games that they're never going to get to. And it has led to recency being a lot less meaningful to me. I no longer feel the need to stay as current with games because, generally speaking, it's more economical for me not to be.
Do you think part of that's because most of the games you're buying or playing on Steam aren't going to be part of a larger franchise? So, like, there's no reason to stay up on installments in that case.
To some extent, and I'm not highly competitive. I'm not into the online multiplayer. I'm competitive, but I'm not into the competitive multiplayer shooter scene or fighting game scene. So there's not as much of a zeitgeist reason to be playing as soon as a game drops for me. Generally speaking, I play single-player games, so if a game gets, a dead community, I can still read all the forum posts from when that game was, hotly talked about.
I think that Steam for me, while I do have one of those large backlogs, and it's not as large as it used to be because I've been chewing through a lot of my backlog via this podcast.
Yep, that's what this podcast is for.
This podcast is an excuse for us to narrow down our backlogs. But Steam has made me do one of two things. It has made me wait to buy a game, not just make snap purchases, but I have been more patient about my purchases because I know that there's no rush. It's never going to be out of stock.
Yep, that's a big thing. It's never going to be out of stock, and if you show up day of, no one's going to ever say, well, I guess you didn't pre-order it, so...
You didn't camp out the night before, so you weren't first in line and, whatever.
Guess you can leave.
Yeah, yeah. And it also has made me value portability a lot. So some of the games that I buy, I will buy off of Steam if they are portable and I can pretty easily take them from one place to the next. One game that is in my library is Tales of Zestiria, which is a Tales of game, and they're really long, mega JRPG, lengthy games. I don't have to be locked in to my couch to play that game now. That game could easily take me 300 hours if I decide to play it all the way through, but I don't have to spend 300 out of those 300 hours on the couch in my living room. I could do it in the airport. I could do it in my room. I could do it at my friend's house. I could do it whenever. So it's made me able to play more games because I know that I don't have to necessarily be in my house on my couch with my controller and my console to play them. So it's actually in some ways unlocked some games for me that I wouldn't otherwise have picked up because I'm like, man, I'm not going to be able to sit there and play this game for 300 hours or however long it's going to take me. But now, since Steam makes basically any console experience portable to a degree, it's unlocked some game choices for me.
Yeah, and for me, a lot of the smaller games that I've been suggesting on the podcast are because of stuff like the Humble Bundle, and because many of those systems basically pay out their games in the form of Steam. I've gotten a bunch of games that I really enjoy on the cheap just because of a bundle popping up and being available. And Steam basically innovated. It is one of the best places for digital sales. It basically forced other companies' hands when it comes to discounting games, because ostensibly there's no reason it ever needs to be discounted. There's no shelf space they need to free up, so they have to have a sale. They are sales just to try and gin up actual, move product. They have no retail space. They have very little overhead, but they do it just to goose sales every once in a while. It's great as a consumer. It does make these games a lot more expendable, though, or fungible. I find that, at least from my perspective, when I look at my backlog, I don't rate games. They all look the same to me in an interesting way. So I don't necessarily think of games in the tiers that I once did, where there were the $60 games, and then the downloadable games, and then the super duper short games. Now, since they're all just on the list together, there's no box art difference. There's no real. They're just names on a list. They're just titles. All of a sudden, they all kind of hold equal rank in my heart in terms of whether I should play them or not. And it's an interesting side effect of the kind of democratized format that Steam uses.
Now, if we could, I'd like to return to something, Gino, you mentioned a little bit earlier, is just about genre, right? And how sort of genre impacts these sort of buying decisions. I mean, when you look at things like literature, the decision to label something as, I'll just use my field, science fiction or not, is, one, it's a criticism decision, but two, it's also a marketing strategy, right? Because most of the time you create an ingrown audience, right? You science fiction fans, but you alienate a whole bunch of other people, either, critics or consumers who don't necessarily want to be labeled as science fiction readers, who don't traditionally think of themselves that way. But I don't think you see the same sort of issue with games. Like, you don't really look at a game too often and people will say, like, well, is it these might not be genres, these might be modes, I guess, but is it a first-person shooter, is it a platformer, is it something like that? And it might be because it's mechanics. And maybe I'm not differentiating genre and mode specifically enough, but I don't see that same sort of argumentation about what we label games as in that sense.
It happens, but those discussions, I feel like, because for so long games were treated on a critical level as, when they were being judged, it was on a arbitrary scale from 1 to 10 for any game of any genre. And most game criticism, most game sites, most game magazines treated them all with equal weight. And so if a new big game came out, it was going to get coverage in the same exact places, because gaming media was small enough that they had to have someone who was capable. They had to have at least one or two people that could cover any given genre and bring it all together. Whereas if you were trying to get into a specific subgenre of movie or book or sport, those things would be broken out into their own media streams on top of, their genre distinctions. Nowadays there are even nichier game sites that will, focus in on first-person shooters or fighting games, these hyper-specific focuses. But for so long, games media was so monolithic, trying to cover everything, that it kind of exposed an entire generation of people to all different types of games, at least in terms of theory and in terms of knowing their relative strengths and weaknesses. Whereas I feel like in other mediums, I should say, you would have to seek out criticism of genres that you don't like, whereas you would see like the Madden review every year in a game magazine, whether you gave a shit about Madden or not.
But I mean, I agree with you completely in terms of criticism. But if we look at it from like a marketing perspective, right? Well, let's pick a game that sort of straddles a line, right? The first one that comes to mind is just BioShock, right? Like suppose retailers, whoever, wanted to label BioShock as a first-person shooter. I don't think you'd see developers being like, no, 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 we don't want to be pigeonholed like that. We consider ourselves RPG developers. This isn't a first-person shooter. This is an RPG. And I don't think you see that same reaction. Whereas if you look at authors, like I'm gonna forget the name. It might have been Ursula K. Le Guin. People write science fiction books, but they go, no, 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 I'm not a science fiction author. That's not what I write.
I can think of a couple of circumstances where there are exceptions to that. Survival horror is one that jumps out to me. A lot of games that are trying to be mass market desperately run away from the survival horror label. Like, for example, Dead Space. For as much as it was about horror, they were also very much talking about it as a third-person shooter, so that it was not confused for like a Silent Hill or a Resident Evil. Resident Evil games, as they've gotten more action-y, have also kind of shed some of the survival horror. Now they've actually started coming back to them, but I was thinking around like Resident Evil 4 and 5, they were starting to become more shooters, just action, third-person action games that happen to have horror elements. And that was directly to chase a larger audience. Mass Effect, I think 3, when it picked up multiplayer, I remember Mass Effect 2 and 3 started marketing themselves more as third-person shooters with RPG elements instead of hardcore RPGs that happen to use shooting as its central gameplay. And so you get these kind of breakdowns where one genre is more popular than the other. So even though this game probably fits more neatly into another category, we want to talk up the elements of this more popular genre that happen to be in this game. It gets interesting. It's more for specific games from very large publishers, generally speaking, because they have to make back budget. They have to go for the widest possible audience. So if you're developing in a niche genre, you have to highlight, hey, we're also operating in these very popular genres. Please pay attention to my game.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I mean, there's not the same sort of malign. I mean, maybe dating sims or something, but there isn't too many genres that are just themselves maligned that you might see in other areas. Like, the Oscars never recognize comedies for whatever reason like that.
I mean, I think a dating sim, or I should say it in this other way, actually, I think a developer who wants to make a visual novel that might have a romance component would want to run away from being called a dating sim.
Yeah, I think that's the one obvious case of this sort of thing.
I think that walking simulator has been used as a pejorative for games like Gone Home, and even to a certain extent some of the Telltale games, some of those adventure games. Isn't
walking simulator just by its... Isn't that just like inherently an uncharitable name for the game?
Yeah, it's a pejorative. It's totally just used as an insult, but story-heavy games with not a lot of action tend to be pejoratively described that way. Though usually the developers are not that big, so they don't generally care. Like, it's not like they were losing a bunch of sales. It's not like the people who were going to play Call of Duty 4 were necessarily, scrapping to play Gone Home. And had they just known that there was a slight genre tweak, they would have played it. This didn't appeal to them to begin with. So, taking pot shots at a game you would never play. I guess with sports games, that can also be its own little thing. Because sports games almost never are considered for Game of the Year or high-level awards.
Because they're never good.
That's fair. Not since Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2.
Has there been a good sports game? You're right.
But someone's out there playing sports games and just going, Madden was so good this year. Why wasn't it considered? They keep talking about The Witcher. What's up with that? Eli Manning's not in The Witcher.
So, the original question that was asked is, how does where we acquire our games, where we buy our games affect how we play them or how we feel about them? We've kind of beat Steam to death, and we know. I mean, everyone knows that Steam is a very revolutionary way to buy and sell games. We've also hit GameStop a lot because that's also very obvious, very in your face. But I would put out a couple of other areas of how do we acquire games. I would include as its own category, having them received as a gift, as a way that would impact how you interact with the game. So I would consider gift, buying from like small business, kind of like the mom and pop shop game store, is a different category we should hit on.
Yeah, I think I talked about that a lot.
Yeah, we did borrowing from a friend
And renting. We are the last generation.
and renting from Blockbuster, but also I would put other as like illegitimately acquiring games.
Yes,
Which we
and I think we
probably
should talk about that.
Should not talk about it as much, but like it still is a legit topic.
I think
Totally.
across all these, what you see too, and I'm sure this is going to come up in the discussion, is price point. I mean,
Right.
how much I pay for a game is drastically going to affect how I interact with it.
I think the last thing that I'd say about a GameStop experience is I'm almost certainly going to pay the maximum dollars for any of those games. So if I'm going to buy a game from GameStop, I am damn sure going to get every penny's worth out of it. Because if it's a new game, oh God, drop $60. Even if it's a used game, 20 to 30 easily.
Yeah,
Right?
and what a more predatory, like pre-ordering and game trade-ins, the two most predatory practices in video game sales.
Yeah, they're pretty bad. Now, you wanted an ISO on this, I think, Pete, on those two topics. Did you have anything to say other than they're incredibly predatory?
No, I mean, I can't count how many times. I'm sure everybody who's played games for long enough has had this experience where you go and you just stack like old games up on the table, and GameStop's just like, yeah, I'll give you $2 for that one, $3 for this other one. Because really, what else are you going to do? Your options are keep it or swallow whatever it is they want to give you for that. And it's just, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if my complaint's even valid. I just hate it, and I'm angry.
Yeah, thankfully, I've had a very privileged upbringing to where I never had to trade in a game, and I feel terrible for everyone who has had to trade them in because it's such a ripoff. And that, like, the first time I asked how much they would give me for a game and they said $3, I was like, I'm never going to do this ever. I have infinitely more of a chance of going back and playing this game and wanting to play it for like 5 minutes than that $3 being the difference for me. Now, that is an incredibly privileged thing to be able to say in the first place, and I acknowledge that. But what a dirtbag like model for your company, and that's kind of why GameStop's not doing great.
I don't think it's quite as privileged as you think, because I don't think that notion is coming from a position of privilege as much as it is coming from a position of your appreciation of that game you bought.
Oh, no. I mean, the difference is I would be able to buy the next game without that $3.
But
some
I think
people
for
need
me,
to cobble together.
You're right. Some people need to sell their games to get the next game they want to play, and that's totally legit. But I'm thinking about it from like a utility-based standpoint. The $3 that I gain from never owning that game again is probably going to give me less utility than the chance of me playing that game years from now and having X amount of fun playing
Certainly.
it again. So I replay games all the time. And if I have a game that's been sitting on my shelf for 10, 15 years and I just pick it up again for a weekend and that would have been $3 in my pocket, I've just completely blown that $3 out.
Yeah, when I'm saying privilege, I mean having a choice at all is the part where it's privileged. I can choose not to. Other people might not. Their choice might be get a new game or don't. Mine was get a new game and save $3 and lose this game, or get the new game anyway and have both, which is not a choice everyone gets to make. And
Fair.
GameStop, were it not for GameStop's incredibly aggressive pre-order pushing and upselling, there are some games on my shelf that I would not necessarily have. For example, I have a metal case version of Final Fantasy XII that came with a disc that just had trailers for other Final Fantasy games on it.
Oh, hells yeah. That's that good stuff.
I had the collector's edition game guide to that game also. That is my least favorite Final Fantasy game I own. And I have the collector's editions to both. I have the collector's edition to Final Fantasy Dirge of Cerberus, I think. That's not a good. I didn't do good.
No,
That
that's
wasn't a good
That's
investment.
not a good look. I mean,
But I
maybe over
have it.
time, like you're going to be on Antiques Roadshow, like 60 years from now, you're going to put it on the table and like, oh, Dirge of Cerberus. Well, then some long story. This is worth nothing, but thank you for bringing it in.
Oh wow, this was a great. Let's see if it's the first print run. No, if it was the first print run, it would be $2. However, it's not, so it's worth $1. Good day.
So when I pre-ordered a GameCube, I got a copy of a semi-rare game disc, which is the Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition. And that is a single GameCube disc, one GameCube disc that has the original Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2 Adventure of Link, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and a 20-minute demo of Wind Waker all on one disc.
What?
All
That
on
game-
one disc.
It sells for as much as $150 online.
Yeah.
That is a fucking
Damn, that's
good
legit.
game to have.
Way to go.
I
Nailed
also have a copy of Legend of Zelda Master Quest, which is Ocarina of Time Master Quest, which is also from a pre-order like promo edition, and it is one disc that has original Ocarina and Master Quest Ocarina on the same disc. In this case, I am all in favor of pre-orders, essentially rewarding the most loyal customers of a particular series with content that only they would truly appreciate. I
Sure.
don't think pre-ordering so like let's say we did a pre-order and like somebody buys the new Madden game, but then they also get like the new Call of Duty game 20% off. Like that's just garbage pre-order cross promotion. Like I think that's
Or-
terrible.
What if you say pre-ordered Mass Effect 2 and you got a unique armor set that you could wear because you pre-ordered it from GameStop, but if you pre-ordered it from Amazon.com, you got a different armor set, and then if you pre-ordered it from Walmart, you got a different armor set, and in order to get all the items in that game, you would have to have a pre-order at 4 or 5 different retailers. What about that? How's that sound?
That sounds
Bad.
that sounds pretty dog shit.
It sounds like dystopia.
Or if you pre-order it, you get access to better and more powerful items at the very beginning, so you can crush other non-pre-ordering game players.
Yeah. I just want to call something out after Billy's riff on Legend of Zelda. You are wearing a Legend of Zelda collared shirt right now.
It's a polo
Oh shit, yes.
with the Himalayan crest on my breast.
I don't enjoy the way you're rubbing yourself right now.
I very much
He's
enjoy
gonna
the
start
way
licking
I'm
games
rubbing
pretty
myself.
soon,
I'm gonna.
so.
I need to find the nearest game to lick.
I see it in his eyes. He's got a hunger.
So
So we've covered GameStop.
I think pre-order has a place. I think it is abused for most of the time, but pre-order has a great opportunity that is squandered in that I like
almost all
it
the time.
almost all the time. Very rarely is it ever not squandered. Most of the time it's not squandered by Nintendo. Just throwing it out there.
Did you guys ever have the experience of pre-ordering it and then showing up the day of release and then them having sold your pre-order copy?
It's never
and not
happened to
having
me,
it?
but I do know that that is a thing.
The other thing is pre-ordering a game that's broken, and then you just have to wait for them to patch it anyway.
I
Yeah.
pre-ordered Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess and waited in development hell for almost 2 years for that game to actually come out. There was like a cork board on the hallway outside of my room, and I had it thumbtacked my little pre-order receipt to that board, and so I walked past it every day and sort of caressed it gently for 2 years until Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess was actually released.
I hope to goodness that I never pre-order a game that then never comes out. Like, could you imagine the person who pre-ordered Final Fantasy Versus 13? That game doesn't exist anymore. It's Final Fantasy 15 now. That Versus became 15. It was in development hell for like 7 years. It was announced when the PS3 was new, and it came out for the PS4. You know that GameStop took pre-orders on that thing.
Oh, of course they did. Like, why wouldn't they?
Like, your pre-order is now for a game. One, the name changed. Two, it's on a completely different system.
It's like a
racket.
bookie, like trying to take action for like a game that actually never plays out, a game that
Like
never ends.
those Kickstarters that get funded and then just like no product ever gets made.
Yeah.
Shit.
Yeah.
Heaven help you if you pre-bought it and then that happens.
Does anybody have any pre-orders hanging out there right now?
No.
No.
I mean,
I
I don't.
do.
Pre-ordered anything since I could drive myself to the mall.
I do.
Yes.
I have a pre-order hanging out there right
Why?
now.
Okay, Billy, why?
I pre-ordered Pyre,
Okay, that's fair.
Super Giant Games.
Now, did you consider that you could have bought it from Supergiant's digital store and possibly given them more money than had you pre-ordered it?
I didn't think about that.
Because if the goal was to be a good patron, that $5 goes to GameStop.
No.
$5
I pre-ordered
does
it
not
on
go to the-
Steam. So like I guess
Oh, then
part of
that's
it goes
probably
to Steam.
the same. That's probably the same. Valve gets. Wait, what does pre-ordering on Steam do?
I don't know.
What does that
I,
even mean?
I got something for it, but I can't remember exactly what I got.
I guess you can preload it. Usually they have like preloads where you can load the game and then it unlocks the day of release. But I think you could just buy it off the store. It's a digital storefront, Billy. They're not going to sell out.
Oh,
Listen, we ran out of internet today. Like, I'm sorry, I just can't help you.
Go home.
I get the whole game for cheaper if I pre-purchased it.
Okay, that's
that
fair.
makes sense. That's a good deal.
I got a discount on the final product by pre-purchasing it.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's kind of an interesting way to do the discounts because the first sale that comes for Pyre, like 6 months after it comes out or a year after it comes out, will probably discount it back to that number. So you can either pre-purchase it at a discounted rate and kind of lock in a sale price. Or
It ties into what I said earlier. When I do Steam, I don't pay full price for games.
Yep.
So this was my chance to get it when it releases and not pay full price for a game. So I just had all my needs met that way.
Should we talk about the way to pay the lowest possible price for games now?
Ooh, that's my favorite way.
Life hack. Steal it.
Now,
Good
hang
tip.
on.
Good tip.
Yo, some people are like, stuff's so expensive nowadays. I've got a life hack for you. What if you don't pay for it? Because you take it, and then you just walk out. Life hack.
Now, hang on.
One time, there was a person who I just really didn't like anymore. I didn't really enjoy their company.
So
and
I
so
ended him.
life
You can
hack,
say my name, Gino.
life hack, I killed the guy. And now I don't have to deal with him anymore. Life hack.
I got really sick of paying rent, so I decided to go to prison. No more rent. Life hack.
Life hack.
All right,
Billy,
so
what were you saying?
I think between the three of us, I probably have the most illegitimately acquired video games.
Yes, I've never pirated a game.
All right,
Nor
Happy to say.
have I.
I
I've borrowed one and never returned it, but
am a
You returned
big
my copy
fan.
of Persona 4. Thank you for that.
yeah, I returned that one.
I'm
It's
a
not
big-
used, you know.
I'm a big fan of emulating because emulation, when used appropriately, is a way to revitalize a community around a game where it otherwise would have died long ago. So in most of my cases, I don't really emulate games that I don't already own in some way. And that legitimizes a lot of what emulation is at its core. For anyone who maybe is not aware of what emulation is, it's where you are able to acquire the technology of an old game console and have it run through your desktop or laptop or some other device that can support emulation. Emulating Nintendo consoles is really easy. So the NES, the N64, the Game Boy, very easy because all those games use cartridges and they're
You can ROM dump those really easily.
yeah, like you can just get the ROM for that game and you get the reader for that file and it's way easy. Emulating on like a PlayStation game requires the console UI, it requires the BIOS, it requires like a disk reader, it requires the The game file requires like drivers for the fake disk reader. It's way more complicated. So first off, if you can set up your PlayStation emulator, props to you, man. You did a lot of work.
Way to go.
Okay.
Way to go, champ.
Way to go. So you have to really, really look for it and earn it. Not saying that you didn't. It's true. You did not pay Sony for that, but you're now participating in a community. The same community, in many cases, that mods games for free and they don't make any money off of it. Like the people that mod the games don't make any money off of it. People that make the skins for my hacked version of Super Smash Bros. Brawl don't make money off that stuff. That's a great community. But, and so yeah, in some senses, there is a way to cheat out profits from the developers and the companies that promote those games. But in most of the cases, these are like 20, 25-year-old games now, honestly. And us using emulation is a second breath of life, a second appreciation for the art form. So if you take the business part out of it, I think it's a completely legitimate platform of gameplay experience. Just take the dollars out and there's no problem. The only problem with emulation is that in some sense, yes, there is someone losing out profit for their work as a result of emulation. I think that's the only drawback. Now, when I emulate a game,
but Billy, that's what stealing is. You basically just said if you take out the part where the person dies, I don't think murder's all that bad.
Man, I tried to couch it so well.
Look, when you start bringing in, all right, these are games that people aren't even selling anymore, right? Like they're not producing new copies of these 25-year-old games.
They're not
then
on the store shelves.
Then it makes a little bit more sense. Yeah.
Right. Like you can't find a copy of, some of these games that I might want to emulate. For example, one game that I emulated recently was Banjo-Kazooie. Great game.
Incredible game.
Probably the best game of 1998.
Sure, whatever. I couldn't tell you what else came out in that.
But, well, if you look up 1998, Pete, just in your spare time, that was a fucking great year of video games. Just Google search like games that came out in 1998. The list is just shocking.
Killer
that
vintage.
Game was probably the best year of video games. Anyway, that's beside the point. I walk into any game store. GameStop's not going to have it. A mom and pop store might have it, but that's a huge toss-up. An online retailer, I'm probably going to spend hundreds, plural, dollars on like a new or a new version of that game because it's so popular. Is that fair? The developer's not getting that money. The developer's getting none of that money. The developer has no piece of the pie of someone buying an unopened copy of a game and never opening it because they're a collector and then selling it for 10 times what it was worth when it was released later. So in that case, am I really taking any money from the developer? No. I don't have a way to pay the developer. I can't buy it from GameStop, who bought it from them as a retailer.
This is a kick-ass year. I mean, I got distracted now looking at it, but there are some great games.
1998, man, I'm fucking telling you. That game, just throw a couple out that came out in 1998.
So this says Ocarina of Time came out in 98 too, November 23rd. Banjo-Kazooie, Pokemon Red and Blue.
Yep.
Let's see what else. Half-Life.
Did GoldenEye come out in that year too?
GoldenEye at the very beginning of the year.
1998, fucking best year of video games, honestly.
Yeah, 1998 was a lit year.
Yoshi's Story.
Was that Final Fantasy VII also?
I think that was 98. Did Final Fantasy VII have 1998 as well?
Yeah, that was a StarCraft.
Yeah, StarCraft.
StarCraft.
Yep.
The initial release date was 97 for Final Fantasy VII.
Wait, does
that
mean it's the year of Final Fantasy VIII?
There are Chocobo's Dungeon 2.
See,
nope.
Final Fantasy VII was 97. Final Fantasy VIII was 99. Did not have any participation in.
Fuck.
So, Gino,
Where's
you
Ray
stepped away
Fencer
for
Musashi and all this?
you stepped away for just a second. I want you to respond to the point that I made, where basically Pete said what I'm doing is stealing.
I mean, it is
But I said,
legally.
hey, look, let's take Banjo-Kazooie for example, a game that I recently emulated. I want to buy that game. I want to pay somebody money for that game, right? How do
You should
I
get
do
an
that?
Xbox. You can buy it on Xbox right now. It's a downloadable.
I'm not touching a Microsoft console. Fuck you. All right,
Well,
so
if you say I'm not going to purchase, I won't take the steps to purchase it, then there's not much I can say.
No,
it's like,
what I'm saying is
Billy will spend the money. He's not going to spend the money.
Forget
fuck you, I'm not going to a Walmart. Well, it's a Walmart exclusive. What do you want from me?
Take some other game that is a good game from that era.
That actually is hard to find and buy?
Right, but GameStop doesn't have it. A mom and pop store doesn't have it. I could buy it from Amazon or eBay, but that's not buying it from the developer. That's buying it from some collector who has this game and is now selling it for $200 on eBay. So
sure.
Who am I stealing from? Not the developer. Am I quote unquote stealing? I don't think. I think there's
Yes.
enough disconnect that in some cases it's not anymore.
Remember, have you ever seen a VHS tape? And at the beginning of the VHS tape, it says if you're watching a copied version of this, you're committing a felony, or if you duplicate this tape, that
You're
is
going
still
to jail,
true.
Billy.
Yep. 1, you're going to jail. 2, I think there are legitimate reasons to emulate, beyond just like I can't find it, or I don't want to pay for it, I don't want to own this console. Like, for example,
Like if I could call Rare and be like, "Hey, you got an extra copy of Banjo-Kazooie? Oh, how much is it? Infinity dollars? Great, sign me up."
well, on the one hand, there are some circumstances where the physical copies, I'm not that sympathetic to, I don't want to buy the console where it's available, or I don't want to buy it on Amazon.
Hang
I
on,
know that
I think I gotta push back against the Amazon thing because I'm not buying it from the dev. I'm not buying it from any retailer that company got any money for. I'm not supporting Sony or Nintendo, companies that I like to support, and I'm not supporting the dev that made the game. I'm only lining the pockets of a collector.
Yeah, but you're supporting a secondary economy.
I don't care about that economy. That economy is worthless. That economy is equivalent to me as a person who buys all the tickets for PAX East and then sells them on shitty secondhand websites. Just because they want to make money that way. I don't give a shit about that economy.
Your favorite video game store is a used game store, Billy.
Hang on. That is different. That's
How?
different.
Explain how.
That's different from
I've gone with you to that store. Every time we go there, it's a delight. It's a treat.
It's a wonderful store, but that store is inherently different from a person having a game that they have a copy of and selling it at a like new mint condition price on the internet because it has that novelty. If I go to Bits and Pixels, they have cool t-shirts, they've got cool handmade game swag items, they have retro games, and if I could find that game at that store, I would drop dollars immediately for it.
But
right?
Most of those online storefronts that you see on Amazon are those little mom and pop shops, just ones you haven't personally been to. Same thing with eBay. A lot of those are either digital storefronts for retail stores, or they are collectors. But you know what? Those collectors keep those games in mint condition and keep those games circulating instead of just sitting on them. So the fact that they're even making them available at all means, you kind of have to pay what the going rate is. But
I think we're going to get into an unwinnable for either side argument over semantics of what stealing is.
No.
At this point.
I mean, the legal definition of stealing is on my side on this one.
No.
You're acquiring something without paying for it.
I'm acquiring something that doesn't need to be paid for.
No, it does.
Says who?
The government.
The U.S. government, yeah.
Then I'm an anarchist. Woo!
Yeah. Now, reasons I can legitimately see legitimate cause for emulation would be, one, if the game is no longer owned, like if the IP is no longer owned by any company, so it cannot be reproduced. There are some IPs that just are not. The companies went bankrupt, and the IP never got bought, or it's in a dubious ownership situation and it will never be re-released. Those are situations where you will never get a legitimate copy due to physical media degradation. Like some, over time, things like Nintendo NES cartridges, they have batteries that store the saves for games on a Nintendo cartridge. As those batteries go, it becomes more and more difficult to actually play those games and have save states, which is what, a lot of those games become kind of unplayable if you can't save. There are some Atari games, really old games like that have just degraded to the point where you can't play them anymore. Like the ROMs don't work. And so getting a physical copy is almost impossible. And this isn't like almost impossible in that it's expensive or it's a little bit difficult or you have to ask like a shady person on Amazon. I'm talking about situations where even if you want the game, you can't have it. Like there's no price because you can't buy it. Those are situations where I think emulation, there's an argument to be made that you can't have, a history of your medium if there are certain games that just cannot be accessed anymore through legitimate or, through any legitimate means. I think there's one argument. And the other argument is I think the speedrunning community and the communities that want to dive deep into games, there are things that emulators allow you to do with games that you can't do without them. For example, you can comb through memory when something's emulated. You can actually look at the code as it's running, and you can figure out things about the game's behavior that you otherwise would not have known. For example, there are some emulated or some some assisted speedruns that have been figured out because people ran through an emulator, tried weird stuff with inputs, and were able to see where things were stored. And so you can get into like weird glitches that then when you play on a legit copy of the game, they still work because you're just using the source code. Like I think one of my favorite speedrun tactics from Final Fantasy IX was based on someone going into an emulator and looking at the AI of a particular boss and figuring out how to trick it. Or there was a speedrun I saw in Pokemon where someone just like by moving a certain way and like using a particular set of inputs and then opening a door, they managed to put into memory basically a jump to the end of the Elite Four talking to Professor Oak. And so they just like the beginning of the speedrun was just the character just like dancing around for no good reason, and then they just open up Ash's like front door, and then you're at the end of the game. And that's the sort of thing that without an emulator to show you what the value needs to be and how you can get it there, there's no way you can do that. So I think that there's legitimate reasons, like there are things that emulation allows and gameplay experiences that emulation allows that cannot be had through legitimate means, and they add value to the overall gaming community. And so that's why I don't demonize all piracy. However, I do demonize most piracy of new games if you have an option to buy it in the first place. I think you get into some gray areas with the older stuff. I think you get into some gray area basically with games that have been out for decades is where you get into the gray areas. But with new games, the gray areas are largely based around access in your country and financial situations. There are some people who cannot buy a new copy of a game regardless of the price. They just can't do it. And so it was an option of not buying the game and not playing it, or not buying the game and playing it. And then it's a bit more interesting of a discussion, though that discussion is still the discussion about is stealing okay.
So I have no problem with the person in another country who cannot get their hands on this copy of a game, so if they want to experience it, they must resort to emulating. Or a speedrunner who says, I cannot do what I need to do to accomplish this one goal I have with this game unless I can digitally crack it. That is someone doing like a personal project. It's not necessarily the original game's intent. It's like kind of this weird gray area. Fine. I still have this massive problem with the chain of discontinuity between me emulating a game and some form of theft occurring. Because by any definition that I've just Google searched in the last 10 minutes, you're right that a definition of stealing is taking without permission or legal right. But
Your Honor, I've Google searched theft for 10 minutes, and let me tell you, Your Honor, I'm going to read you some definitions. Merriam-Webster says,
right,
thievery is
right. So
Oxford English Dictionary himself defines stealing as.
Professor Oxford.
Now, when you made that comment of the FBI warning at the beginning of the VHS tapes or the DVDs or whatever they are, that's because Universal Studios doesn't want you pirating their movie because other people are going to have to pay for it to see it. Fair. That's legit. Okay? Hundreds of years from now, is that VHS warning still going to hold the same weight? Or can you copy No, it's not.
Well,
no one's going to be part of that causal chain anymore.
Well, in 100 years, it'll enter the public domain, so it's
yes,
no longer copyrighted.
All right, fine.
Yes. Copyright law.
Again,
if
I
Disney
think
will
that
ever
is-
allow
I think
copyrights
that's
to end.
semantic at this point.
It's
But
not semantic
It's
because
not
at that point it's
semantic.
illegal.
all right, fine. So
That's why you can just copy Arthur Conan Doyle and you can write your own Sherlock Holmes novels if you feel like it.
Like
If
the
you want to
Rehab
read Sherlock
Boulevard did.
Holmes. Oh, he did?
He wrote one about his brother. I want to say Minecraft.
Mycroft Holmes.
Mycroft Holmes. Yeah.
Well, if anyone wants to read my Sherlock Holmes novel, Sherlock Holmes and the Curious Case of the Gunblade, you can pick that up.
No one does.
What I want to point out here is there is a time I would not if somebody had a PS4 emulator out there and had all the new hot PS4 games, I wouldn't be interested. Because I am a big proponent of letting my dollars decide what games get made. I want my dollars to be in support of the developers that I like. I want my dollars to be in support of the kind of games that I like. But when I get a copy of Chrono Trigger on the PS1 emulator that I have, how am I going to in any way get my dollars to that developer?
You can buy digital versions of Chrono Trigger on the PlayStation Network right now, and that goes to Square Enix.
Okay. So
I did that.
Though I'm not picking good examples, but there's some games that doesn't apply for.
Yes, but those are games where
those are the games that I emulate the most. Like if a game was available on Steam, I will rebuy it. I have rebought games because they've just come out on collector's edition. I'm like the king of rebuying games. I've got probably 6 copies of Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time.
that's fine,
That's
but
too
you
bad.
having 6 copies of Ocarina
That's not
of
fine. Don't
Time.
listen to Gino.
Well, what I was going to say is that's fine, but that doesn't give you license to then pirate other games because you've patronized some things more.
What I'm trying to say is how far can the chain of continuity reach that I'm actually slighting a developer? In a case where there isn't a Square Enix network that I can buy all their old games from. Just pick an example where it's not like that. I'm going to go look at my list of emulated games real quick and see what I actually have available. But
And I already mentioned some gray areas.
Yeah.
If you wanted to play a game for the Commodore 64 that was made by a defunct company, the company isn't there to get your money. No one's ever going to re-release it. It's very hard to get those original copies in the first place. In that case, emulation is almost the only way you can play that game and almost the only way that anyone could have access to it. It's really dubious, it's really gray, but I have no problem with it. But more recent stuff is that developers would really like you to just rebuy their collector's editions and download-only versions.
I do. I love it. But I guess I'm just picking up arms for the gray areas. Maybe we don't actually have an argument because we agree, but the gray areas are what I'm fighting for, and I think that emulation stands as one of the areas where it's like the last bastion of some of these games, because
Yes.
they wouldn't get the love or attention otherwise.
Yes, and I think there are some games that would not be played at all were it not for emulation at this point. But unfortunately, I just wish that we had more legal means to buy these and more incentives for companies to put their games onto legitimate, downloadable stores. Because, for example, here's one that I've wanted to buy digitally for forever. Legend of Legaia is a game that I have for the PlayStation 1. It was not a very popular game. It was like from the Legend of Dragoon people or like another similar
Legend
developer.
of Dragoon, way good.
Early in the PlayStation lifespan. I love that game a whole lot. My disc got scratched when I was like
Licking it?
10. No, weirdly enough. I wasn't licking it when it got scratched.
What
But
are
it
you
got
doing?
scratched nonetheless. My teeth... Do I have like a cat tongue? I'm going to scratch this disc with my tongue?
For whatever reason, I thought you had a tongue stud, Gino, when you were 10 years old, but I guess I'm misremembering that. That's my fault.
Yeah, I've learned how to speak with a tongue stud really well. But that disc, I couldn't get past like a third of the way through the game. I was looking for a disc copy. That game is $80 now. $80 or $90. Most of the places online that I was looking for it. I finally found it, I think, at a PAX 3 years ago. And now I have a copy of it, a physical copy. It cost me $45. That was a game that I wished was on PSN for years. Every time I go on PSN, I will check to see if it came out on PlayStation 1 Classics. It is not. I wish that they would just release it. It costs almost nothing to release. But it's not out. So in a situation like that, I basically just didn't play this game that I hold in very high esteem for a decade because I couldn't play it and I couldn't get a hold of a new disc. And that's kind of shitty. But I think that defining the area where piracy is okay is something that I wish that there was a little bit more policing or a little bit finer lines. I think the actual answer here is copyright law shouldn't be like however old Mickey Mouse is this year, because that's what it seems to be. It's just an arbitrary sliding scale that keeps getting older because Mickey Mouse is constantly threatening to go into the public domain. But I just wish that, it was 20 years or 30 years. Most of your natural life, a third of your natural life, should probably be for as long as you can have sole ownership over an intellectual property. Let people innovate and riff and experience things without fear of arrest.
I guess maybe a big part of my love for the air quotes illegitimate and underground realm of gaming is because so much good content has come from it. Good original content has come from it. The idea of something being open source makes something just the possibilities are endless. Even though it's a bad example, look at what Dota is now because of them taking a mod and modding a game into something essentially new. A game was modded into something new, and it is now its own game and now the most lucrative professional game in existence. All right, get off of that cancerous example and probably off of the whole topic of emulation because we probably beat that horse to death.
Yeah, now we're just hashing out the pros and cons of copyright law.
So the only other area that I really want to cover are a couple of areas like borrowing and getting a game as a gift, which both have a $0 cost. And I'll say a game with a $0 cost, we probably all agree we have less investment in finishing it than we do with a game that has a higher cost. But I would say that when I got a game as a gift, one, I researched it more because I didn't want to waste a gift use on a bad game. But also, at a $0 cost, borrowing it from a friend, I didn't do a lot of research at all. Game said, hey, that's fun. Friend said, hey, that game is fun. Can I borrow it? Sure. And I also had less investment in finishing it. So if I were to chop up my life of purchasing games, it'd be like my early years almost exclusively got games as gifts or asked for them from Santa Claus or got them for my birthday. And when I was a teen and had some more autonomy, I was a slave to GameStop and Target and other major retailers. And only now that we've gotten out of that hellscape and we have things like the PlayStation Network and even the Nintendo Store, where I have paid for and purchased a copy of Mario Kart 64 onto my Wii. Great purchase. And Microsoft Marketplace, all this stuff now, Steam. We're in a golden era now of where games are flowing freely, even old games. And I know, Gino, your heart skipped a beat. Probably nearly went into cardiac arrest when Final Fantasy IX came out on Steam.
I mean, yes. Yeah,
So
we played that for the show because it was available again.
Yeah. And that was a qualifier and winner of Game of the Year because of it?
It won Game of the Year.
Yeah.
Game of our year. We didn't make it Game of the Year. I didn't
Yeah.
push for Game of the Year. I made it Game of our year. It beat Pokemon Snap.
That was a hard fight.
That was a struggle.
I just want to throw this out there. I nominated I asked us to play both of those games. So whoever wins, I win.
I think I don't have much more to talk about as far as where me acquiring a game matters as far as how I play it or how I interact with it. But my favorite place to buy a game now is an online retailer or a mom and pop store, because I feel like I am participating, and I guess I should say emulating as well. I guess my top three, if I were to rank them, is like Steam and other online retailers is my number one. Emulating is number two, and mom and pop shops is number three, because I feel like through those means I'm able to support not necessarily the developers or the games themselves, but the communities. I'm more part of a community around that game by participating in those areas of purchase than I am for anything else.
Pete, what about you?
Mostly just Steam or like Amazon. I guess I'm not really, I'm out in the burbs. I don't have too many mom and pop shops available to me, or, same way I buy books, I probably solicit those a little bit more. But I like Steam because, I don't need a whole bunch of boxes coloring things up. And like you guys said, it's available, it's open, and you can find some cool free games a lot too, which is always nice.
Yep. For me, it's probably Steam, then mom and pop shops, then, other digital retailers. I just enjoy going to a mom and pop store, thumbing through all of the weird nonsense that is on the shelves, and finding a winner, finding a gem, finding NBA ballers.
I picked up a copy of Pimp My Ride, the game, recently.
Winners all.
Now,
I have a Stephon Marbury basketball card now.
I missed one thing that I wanted to give like an honorable mention to. I don't know exactly where this falls in the category, but we mentioned it briefly. But stuff like Humble Bundle, I want to just like give not really a discussion point, but like an honorable nod, an honorable mention to, is I am a game that I would not normally buy, but it comes in a bundle, and maybe it would be like the next tier up of bundle. Even if I wouldn't be that interested in it, I'm more inclined to throw money at that because my dollars are also going to a charity. That's a really just kind of niche, weird case, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least give it like a nod in this podcast.
Yeah, and I think another weird niche way is through Kickstarter or similar things.
Sure,
if you have invested in the game's development and then receive the game as part of compensation for your investment, that is a pretty different way to have acquired the game. And I often find that I am deeply incentivized to play and finish that game. Now, I was more likely to buy that game in the first place if I was going to back it at all. But sometimes being able to affect the game's development will greatly increase my overall enjoyment of the game and how I play it. For example, in Massive Chalice, which is a game that Double Fine made, it's a RTS it's kind of an RTS. It's a Final Fantasy Tactics style game. One of those games where it's a grid and your characters just kind of move around and they all have different jobs and skills. But the concept was you're trying to survive for 300 years, so you have multiple generations of warriors who have to kind of go to the field, then have kids so that your generations keep going, and then, they die, their kids rise up. And so you're managing combat and your population, basically. But as a backer incentive, you could put your own family into the game as one of the bloodlines that, fights for you. And I would not have enjoyed that game, I don't think, if my family wasn't in it.
Oh, really?
But with my family in it, I loved it. There was a very different... It was very different. Like, you could name, your parents.
You could be in the game.
Well, it's not me, but, like,
your lineage.
My lineage is, and I, made my family crest with my family and actually submitted it. We got consensus on what it should look like and everything. We got a sign off.
Wowzers.
So that's a game that I have on my shelf, and I'm like, I'm going to show my kids someday.
Yeah, that's a good pre-order incentive. That's quality.
Good pre-order incentive, Gino. Well done.
And that is because of how I bought that game, it is completely different than if I had bought it any other way. A little bit better than an art book. I'll say that much. So I think that's going to do it. This was a lot longer than I thought it would be. Thank you, Jeff Rude, for your suggestion. Remember, if you have a suggestion for a podcast topic you would like us to discuss, I can't promise it will happen immediately because we've got a lot of other things down the pike, but we will definitely get to it because this train don't stop for nothing. We are rapidly approaching 100 episodes.
Rapidly approaching.
Well,
sort of a semantic case there because we're
at 95 episodes.
Yeah. I have in my folder that contains every single episode 97 items, but there's a couple of duplicates here, so there's a certain number of actual Deep Listens episode and a certain number of Deep Listens bonus podcast episodes, and their sum is about to reach 100.
Yes. We are very close. So we will get to your topic. If you want to send us a topic, send us some feedback, go ahead at DeepListensPod on Twitter or at ThatPinguino on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got our comment sections or deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. Thank you, Billy.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Interesting topic. I didn't think I would get that heated about it, but I kind of did. But then again, that's not so out of the ordinary from me. Getting weirdly passionate and podium about topics? No, not Billy.
Not Billy. Thank you, Pete.
Always a pleasure, guys. Make sure you turn in next week. We probably won't discuss meat again. So, good
also,
or bad, depends
Pete,
how you feel about it.
Where's the animal facts? I'm missing them.
Oof.
Yeah, I do miss Pete's animal fact.
I don't know if next week.
I don't want to put you on the
tune in
spot.
next week. I promise next week.
I don't want to put you on the spot.
I got it covered.
I have an animal anecdote I heard. One of my coworkers killed a lionfish with a stick underwater. Lionfish are invasive in the Caribbean.
They're super venomous too.
They're super venomous. He was cataloging fish in underwater because that was his job before he was programming computers. So he was like keeping track of fish, and he saw a lionfish eating one of the fish that he was supposed to count. And he said, "This fish isn't supposed to be here. That fish is. Let it go." And he hit it with a stick, and it wouldn't let go. And so him and his other coworkers beat this fish to death.
Good. Send a message to the rest of them.
So he killed a lionfish with not quite his bare hands. They're very venomous.
Wow.
I told him, when you tell this story, just tell people you killed a lion in its den.
And then just mumble like fish. But
Fish. Fish. It was eating another fish with a stick. So, thank you. That's Deep Listens for this week. Till next time, everyone. Peace!